Well, I'm Sherri Dugger. Welcome to the discussion panel tonight on the Right to Harm film. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for watching the film. It's an important documentary. I think Corey wanted me to say, first off, if you want to text OCA to 33777 to join the email news and alerts system. And also Regeneration International launched a regenerative farm map to help people connect with local regenerative farmers. And I think I put that link in the chat box. So if you want to look at that, you can. Also, if you want to put questions into the chat box, we'll try to have somebody monitoring those. Maybe Alexis or Mike Carberry or somebody can monitor the questions, and maybe we can get some of those questions in from the viewers. So before we begin, I was really hoping, I think it's important to acknowledge the moment we're in here in this country and the role each of us can play within the food and agriculture system to create real and lasting change. Every day we work to strengthen relationships with others, to join movements and to build power, but all too often we don't ask the right questions. We don't look around us to see who's missing from the table. And a lot of times we just simply refuse to see the real and painful work we still need to do. The COVID-19 crisis is killing Blacks at a higher rate. Meatpacking plants are COVID-19 hotspots, impacting the lives and health of ethnic minorities who are being forced back to the production line. We must also acknowledge the racism that's deeply rooted in our food and agriculture system. And I'd like to use this moment to honor the lives and experiences of people of color who are and have been disproportionately suffering. I'd like to honor George Floyd with hope that his death and the deaths of so many before him will inspire the change we desperately need. Right to Harm highlights many of the health disparities often experienced by communities of color. People do not feel safe inside or outside of their homes. CAFOs are more often located in areas populated by people of color. This is, as Dr. Jacoby Wilson said in the film, a form of environmental slavery. So these are realities that we cannot ignore. So thank you to Matt Wechsler and the Right to Harm team for the production of this film, which offers us this opportunity to discuss these important issues. Thank you to Organic Consumers Association and Regeneration International for inviting me to moderate this panel. And with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. So we have Matt Wechsler, who is an award-winning documentarian, sustainable food activist, and urban gardener from Evanston, Illinois. His passion for filmmaking started when he was 10 years old and has blossomed from making short films to exposing social injustice around the country. His 2012 New York Emmy-nominated documentary, Different is the New Normal, aired nationally on PBS and was narrated by Michael J. Fox. His latest film, Sustainable, is now available on Netflix and received the 2016 Accolade Global Humanitarian Award for Outstanding Achievement. We also have John Ikerd, who is Professor Emeritus of Agricultural Economics at the University of Missouri. John was raised on a small dairy farm in Southwest Missouri, and he received his PhD from the University of Missouri in 1970. He spent 30 years on the faculties of North Carolina State University, Oklahoma State University, University of Georgia, and the University of Missouri before retiring in early 2000. He spent the first half of his academic career as a livestock marketing specialist and the second half on issues related to agricultural sustainability. John currently resides in Fairfield, Iowa, a town of just over 10,000 people in a county with numerous CAFOs. We also have Francis Thicke, who with his wife Susan is the owner and operator of an organic dairy and crop farm near Fairfield, Iowa. They process their milk on the farm and market their dairy products through local grocery stores and restaurants. They're also experimenting with regenerative grazing and cropping practices on their farm. Francis has a PhD in soil fertility and has in the past served as the National Program Leader for Soil Science for the USDA Extension Service. We also have Monica Richard Brooks, who is a community leader who organizes against the expansion of mega poultry complexes on the eastern shore of Maryland. Monica co-founded the citizens group Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs, which recently stopped the siting of what would have been the largest ever poultry complex in Maryland. Monica is also on the board of Socially Responsible Agricultural Project and Assateague Coastal Trust. Personally, she is a pastor's wife, a mother, a business owner, and a Spanish teacher. And we also have Ronnie Cummins, who is the co-founder and international director of the Organic Consumers Association and its Mexico affiliate, Via Organica. Cummins has been active as a writer and activist since the 1960s, with extensive experience in public education, grassroots mobilization, and marketplace pressure campaigns. Over the past 2 decades, he has served as director of U.S. and international campaigns dealing with sustainable agriculture issues, including food safety, genetic engineering, factory farming, and global warming. Cummins lives with his wife and 17-year-old son in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So if we could go ahead and get started with our questions for the panel. Monica, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you, and I'd like to simply ask how you're doing at this time and place in our country's history, and what can the agricultural community do to step up to bring about needed change?
Hi, Sherri. Certainly, what's going on, what people are experiencing in our country right now is just a glimpse into what African Americans have been dealing with in this country for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, oftentimes the voices have not been heard. People have just dismissed them as that's not true, that can't be happening, I don't believe it, stop whining, etc. Stop making everything about race. But we're at a pivotal time where, unfortunately, this horrific death of George Floyd has brought more people to an awareness or a desire to connect or to see what's really happening. So that's a good thing, that dialogue is opening. What I say is, one of the things is we need to first look at ourselves and be honest and transparent with ourselves about our own biases, and do what we need to do to set beyond that. Secondly, we need to look around us and see if everybody looks like us, then that's a problem too. That means that we're not doing our part to connect with the global community. And even within the environmental groups, we need to do better with integration there. And even with our, now there's only about, I think it's about 3% of the farms in the US are now Black owned, which it used to be much better. So there are just some things that we can do to just examine ourselves, look beyond where we are and see what we can do to actively get involved, and certainly not look to see ourselves as connected as we are, and speak out. Yeah, you know, and connect. So.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate Right to Harm for so many reasons, but I think, you know, obviously there's a lot of a really good glimpse into the health disparities that are in that film. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into doing the Right to Harm film, what the sort of the origin story of that film was, how it got started?
Yeah, so my wife and I were making the film Sustainable, which is really a film about the environment and the land, and what the land needs to survive, and what farmers can do to support that. And while we were interviewing John Ikerd, who's here with us tonight, for that film, he kind of clued us in on this side of agriculture, which is really a dark side of agriculture that not a lot of people know about. And we saw the social inequalities and the environmental inequalities facing a lot of disenfranchised Americans in this country. And we felt that, you know, we had just done a film that really spoke to environmental issues and animal rights issues. Let's do a film that really speaks to social issues and human rights issues as it relates to the food system, to try to show that we need to build a food system that's equitable for everybody.
Absolutely. I've recently in conversations had a lot of talk about how we're seeing the lack of humanity in our food system right now in so many ways, with this COVID crisis going on and the things that are happening with industrial agriculture. John, would you like to talk to me a little bit about what's happening with the COVID crisis? It's obviously still a very real crisis in our country. Can you speak a little to how the industrial agriculture system has responded to this versus what we're seeing in local community-based food systems?
Right. I think what we're seeing is clearly revealed kind of the fundamental flaws in this industrial system of food production in general, but particularly in animal agriculture production, because of the impact it's had in the processing plants. Basically, in the pursuit of economic efficiency at the expense of everything else, we basically allowed the big corporations to put together kind of a conveyor belt, or kind of like a factory assembly line that extends all the way, I like to say, from conception to consumption, from the selection of breeding stock, the breeding, the young animals, the feedlots, the processing plants, on through the retailing sector. And it all works like an assembly line. And all the people that we've been talking about are simply cogs in that big machine, where they have these positions on this assembly line. That includes the producers out here, and the CAFOs are caught in this system as well. Right. So how has it responded? About the only way it could. They didn't anticipate that they would have to shut down some sector within that overall assembly line. I saw some early studies and models on how to respond to viruses, pandemics like this that they had put out. And they anticipated that they might have to have absenteeism of 15 or 20% or something like that, but they didn't anticipate that before it even got to 5%, they'd have to close down the whole assembly line. Well, the problem is that these animals that are coming through that assembly line are not like a factory where you're building automobiles. You can't shut them off. The animals continue to grow. The cows continue to give milk. The chickens continue to lay eggs. There wasn't any place for them to go once they closed down the processing plant. And so the producers were caught with them. They were euthanizing animals. They were dumping eggs. They were dumping milk. And total waste for everybody along the line. On the other end, when they had to close down the institutional food systems in the restaurants, the system couldn't adjust so that what product was in the system could go to the grocery stores. So consumers were going to the grocery stores, the shelves were empty, prices were going up, the whole system was in a mess. So I think it was the chairman of one of the big food corporations wrote a New York Times article, a New York Times ad, when it said the system is broken. All he was doing was trying to develop public support so the president then would declare an emergency, which would exempt them from the lawsuits that would occur from putting the workers back to work and forcing them to work in an unhealthy condition. So their response was close down the system, open it up. There isn't any way they can safely put the workers back to work, but they're putting them back to work anyway in places, but we still have sporadic shutdowns. On the other end, the local farmers, the farmers out here that had access to consumers, either through CSAs or farmers markets or online sales or food hubs, had an explosion in demand for their product, particularly those that could go online. Those that had farmers markets that were closed down, indoor farm markets, they immediately went online. They went on to a system where you could order online and go pick it up at the farmers market until they were able to open the farmers markets. Once they opened them, they could spread them out. So you had social distances. They were responding. There's been a tremendous increase in online sales. Online sales at grocery stores doubled in the first few weeks. And more farmers are going online. You saw Greg Guntrip was in the Right to Harm film. Yeah. He produces about 1 million pounds of meat a year, primary poultry and primarily hogs. That's a big operation. He was selling to restaurants primarily. He was able to transition his whole operation, where I saw online that he had gone 100% to direct customer sales within a week or two. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but he made that adjustment. So this is the difference. And I think it's created an opportunity to fundamentally transform the food system if we have the wisdom and the courage to take advantage of this opportunity and begin moving in a fundamentally different direction.
Absolutely. Amen. Francis, I love that you're on this panel, because you do represent, like a farmer like Greg Gunthorpe, who he mentioned, but you represent the other side of what we hope to see. And you've talked a lot about your vision and policy. I hope to ask you a lot of questions about policy tonight if we can. But if you could just tell us, you're in the middle of a lot of CAFOs in Iowa. You are doing something that's drastically different from that industrial agriculture model. Could you tell us a little bit about you and your farm and how you came to your operation and really how you've been doing at this time during this crisis as well?
Unmute. Here we go. I could follow up on what John said, is that we milk about 80 cows, and we process on the farm, and we market it locally to about 6 grocery stores and about 20 restaurants. Well, when the virus crisis came, the restaurants shut down. But since the people locally were then going to the grocery stores, we lost our restaurant market, but our grocery store market increased. So we came out about even. And so John is absolutely right that If it's local, people can have access to it. And if it's an industrial system that just keeps pushing it out. And the problem with the industrial system is when it shuts off is that the farmers get a very low price. Prices go way down for the farmers, but in the grocery store, the prices go way up, as you saw for meat and so on.
Right.
And so it's an asymmetric kind of a situation.
Yeah.
You're right. In Iowa, we have a lot of CAFOs. And as a matter of fact, somebody did an analysis. We have way more manure than we need. And they did a statewide analysis, and they found that the farmers were already putting on enough nitrogen fertilizer, just as fertilizer, and all the manure nitrogen was just excess. And so we hear CAFO operators say that these nutrients are very valuable and they don't want to waste them. But in reality, often they have to just get rid of them, and they don't really utilize them as efficiently as they could.
Right. Absolutely. Ronnie, I want to talk to you about big picture solutions and organizing. You are such a master at that. I would love for you to, I mean, Francis obviously represents regenerative agriculture. It's obviously a solution in our minds. I think all of us on this panel, in terms of how we can sort of pave the way for a new system of agriculture and a new way to feed our communities. Can you talk to us a little bit? I would love for you to define regenerative agriculture as you see it, and also tell us, you know, how this can be a solution, not just for farmers and consumers, but also for the planet.
Yes. Well, I mean, the way we explain regenerative food and farming and land use to organic consumers, very simply, is it's the next stage of organic farming. You know, it incorporates all the good attributes of organic, not using toxic chemicals and not using synthetic fertilizers, you know, not allowing CAFO concentration of animals, actually trying to protest animal husbandry, at least in the spirit of organics. But well, what some of us realized over the last decade or two was that we are facing a tremendous climate crisis, and that we need to make sure that organic sticks to the original vision of organic, which is that we improve the soil, that we produce nutrient-dense food, that we pay attention to social justice and everyone having accessibility to food, and that we spread the word. And the good news, you know, to me in the United States was that after lagging behind the rest of the world in understanding how serious global warming and climate catastrophe are, we are finally starting to catch up in the United States right before the COVID pandemic. And what we've noticed since the COVID pandemic as Organic Consumers Association, our readership has gone way up. We've got several million people who are following us in our newsletters and on social media, and both in English and Spanish. The numbers in the last 3 months have just taken a great big leap. We have noticed that, I mean, you know, I read the polls around the world, but you can see it in the United States. There is a tremendous increase in people's concern about healthy food and a healthy environment. Even though the mass media is not talking about it enough, it's pretty obvious that 90% or more who get really sick from this pandemic are people who have what the media says are prior health conditions. And when you look a little deeper, well, what are these prior health conditions? And you look even deeper than that, what causes these prior health conditions? It comes down to, you know, terrible food. We have the worst food in the industrialized world. We have the unhealthiest population in the industrialized world. We have the most deaths from COVID-19. We see a outrageous discrepancy between African Americans and people of color dying of COVID-19 and being seriously injured. You know, and then it's like the chronic illness in the United States, where we lead the world. Yeah, I mean, 8,000 people die every day in the United States. Most of them die before their time. Most of them die with less of a quality of life than they could have had because they have these chronic diseases. I mean, why have 35,000 of our fellow Americans died in nursing homes? I mean, think about it for a minute. It's not just because they're older. It's like they're in nursing homes taking multiple prescription drugs, typically. They're in nursing homes where they're fed crap, you know. In the middle of the night, some truck pulls up behind the nursing home that says Cisco or U.S. Food Service on the side, and they unload the cheapest, you know, least nutritious, most contaminated food in the industrialized world, you know. So it's a wake-up call, I think, for people, for justice, for the way we treat the environment, for what we're eating, and we need a sea change. You know, we can't hunker down and melt down the economy in our houses long enough to survive this. We can't hunker down and wait for Bill Gates or the Communist Party of China to come up with a vaccine that's going to save us all. We got to get healthy, and we got to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to have access to healthy food, who has access to information about health, about how to strengthen our immune systems, how to keep our vitamin D levels up. We have a right to a long and healthy life, you know, and the mark of a decent country is not, oh, we've got more ventilators than you do. You know?
Right.
The mark of a good country is a healthy population mentally and physically, and we're going to fight for that. When I live in the United States, when I live in Minneapolis, because I live in northern Minnesota a good part of the time, but that's my neighborhood that just got occupied and driven to, you know, the most incredible extremes. The police are an occupying army, you know, but the same thing goes for food justice in our community. You know, people were dying in much larger numbers than they should have been dying in the nursing homes, you know, and in the poor communities. And, you know, Minneapolis, St. Paul is pretty darn good as far as we've built up an alternative food and farming movement over the last 40 or 50 years that is pretty good. But we still have a long way to go. So we can solve the COVID problem. We can solve this problem of a racist, unjust society and the climate problem if we work together. And what we know is that regenerative food farming and land use and food justice are going to play a major role in this process. So I think we're going to kick out a bunch of the worthless politicians in November, and I'm looking forward to going full blast ahead to build a new green New Deal, a new society based on justice and health and regeneration.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think there's so many lessons to learn here, especially in this, you know, in this country right now. And I really appreciate this film. Matt, you must have learned things yourself as you were working on this film. I would love to hear about some of the lessons that you came away with personally, and maybe, you know, if there's one lesson you want Right to Harm viewers to come away with, what would it be?
I guess what I learned the most is it's way worse than I imagined it could possibly be. That's what I learned. And I started off, you know, I was a climate change denier, you know, going back 12 years ago. I didn't believe in the idea of organic food. I didn't think it was possible that an industrial system would want to feed the population with food that wasn't healthy for everyone. I didn't think it was possible that a grocery store, you know, could carry worse food than what was at a farmer's market. I wasn't a farmer's market shopper. Every ounce of research that I did between my sustainable film and the Right to Harm film, you know, just proved that what we need are the fundamental changes that everyone here has talked about. And, you know, I like to think of it as we need equity from the soil all the way up to the consumer. You know, the soil needs to be part of that that equation of the equity within the food system. We need to treat the land appropriately, and we need to treat every level of the food supply chain needs to be valued in order to create a system that will work and will create a healthy society like Ronnie talks about. So
absolutely, thank you. Monica, you founded Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs, and you have your own story to tell about protecting your family's health and quality of life, as well as protecting the well-being of your community and their health. Can you tell us a little bit about your story fighting confinement operations in your area and how you got into this?
Hi. Yeah, I was really enjoying hearing Matt's story and that things that he didn't know before, and I felt the same way. I didn't know anything about a CAFO or a factory farm. I kind of stumbled upon it, finding out that they were going to put a 13 CAFOs on one little plot of land. Actually, at the same time, it would have been on top of our water source, which is called the Paleo Channel. Now, you would think that that would be common sense, that that would not be allowed. However, our county and our elected officials were all in favor of it. And not knowing much, I literally got online and just educated myself super fast. I made an online petition and just started going door to door to people. And going door to door, I connected with some other folk who found out about it, and we formed Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs. And that was an eye-opener to find out. When you think something is just common sense, there's an expression that's common sense is not common. And it apparently was not common to explain to people why not only are these things harmful to our air and water, but then you want to put them on top of our water instead of the citizens. So we were found out that there were some already around, finding out the high respiratory rates here. We have the highest respiratory rates in the whole state of Maryland in this area, and the majority of the highest rates of asthma for middle schoolers. And my own daughter and granddaughter have been diagnosed with asthma, and neither of them have family history. Nobody in my family or my husband has asthma. So we have a problem here already on the Eastern Shore, and just discovering there was no one willing to help us here with this fight. You know, I think people will do whatever they have to do to protect their families, and we have a right to do that. And we just continued to press and press and press consistently on our local level, with all the way up to the state, which we got no love in the state, but yeah. No love on the local. But we were able to find some allies along the way: Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, Food and Water Watch, different groups that came alongside of us, Center for Livable Future at Johns Hopkins, to provide us with the assistance that we needed. And through that, and even some legal work with Dave Reed, we were able to stop that large one, which would have been the largest one in the state of Maryland, and then continue to educate the public about these things. When you're in an area where there's a lot of interwoven, the poultry industry is interwoven in a lot of the culture around here. And so the first thing that was so important was educating people that we're not anti-poultry. You know, you say something about poultry and now you're anti-poultry and you're anti-farmer.
And you're an animal rights activist.
Right. You know, no, and then they're like, oh, you're vegan. I'm not vegan, you know. And so the educating part was so crucial in order to let people know what's going on, and then start to build a momentum and encourage people to speak out, because in these rural communities with all of the poultry interwoven, people don't want to talk. Nobody wants to offend anyone. No one wants to be called out. So you just try to work with what you can. And so It's been good. It's been good, but it's been a fight.
I'm sure. Yeah. Francis, I want to talk to both you and John, and I want to talk to John about economics, and I want to talk to you, Francis, about policy and also about your vision for agriculture in Iowa and across the US. You actually wrote a book about it, A New Vision for Iowa Food and Agriculture. Can you tell us about what you see for food and agriculture, both in your state as well as across the country? You're on mute.
I want to follow up on something Monica said about the toxicity,
Okay.
first
Sure.
of all, because I think a lot of people don't realize why this is toxic. And it's not because the animals stink, and it's not because the manure really smells. Cattle on pasture, there's no manure smell. When the animals are in this industrial system, the manure builds up and it turns anaerobic and it putrefies. And research shows that over 300 volatile organic compounds are created in that liquid, in that putrefying mass. And so these are the toxic materials. And so, and they, of course, they disperse out and they cause the problems. Monica said, asthma, it's been researched and found to be the case. All kinds of respiratory problems and so on, headaches and many things. But the point I want to make is that it's not the animals that smell, and it's not really even the manure. In a natural environment, when my cows drop manure in the pasture, right underneath that cow patty are billions of bacteria just waiting for a meal. And they decompose that aerobically. There's no smell problem, no problem with that. So as far as the vision, it's difficult. In Iowa, we have a very industrialized food system. We have problems with water quality, huge problems. We're making no progress. So the vision, I think, is that we need to feed ourselves. Even in Iowa, we about 85% of our food is imported from out of state. Get that, in Iowa. As a matter of fact, Neil Hamilton, a food activist, said years ago, well, the governor was saying he wanted to make Iowa the food capital of the world. And Neil said, well, Governor, why don't you first make Iowa the food capital of Iowa? Yeah. Because we don't really produce much food we eat here in Iowa. And we could probably produce all the food for Iowans in one county in Iowa. We have 99 counties in Iowa. So we have a lot of capacity to overproduce. And that's what we've been doing in the Midwest and nationwide. We've been overproducing in things like corn, soybeans, all the commodities. And so the result is that the prices are always in the pits, almost always in the pits for farmers. And it works really well for the ADMs and the Cargills and the CAFO owners because they get their inputs really cheap. When they export them to the other countries, they can buy them cheap and sell them for what they can sell them for. So the whole system is really set up to marginalize the farmer. And unfortunately, the farmers don't really unite and try to solve that problem. The farmers seem to go with it. And even, like, for example, in Iowa, all the hogs, virtually all the hogs are owned not by the farmer, but owned by the company that owns the hogs and owns the feed and takes the animal all the way from birth all the way to the grocery store shelf. So the farmer is, as somebody would say, more or less a hog house janitor. Yep. They don't really own them. And so it's really a pathetic situation, but it's really difficult to see how we're going to get out of it. So I haven't given you a very good vision, have I?
Well, we're going to keep talking, so we'll get there, hopefully. John, could you talk to me a little bit about the economics? In a recent paper you wrote, that defenders claim that CAFOs are an economic necessity, and I have gone up against this fight myself when I've testified in front of committees about common sense CAFO regulation. Can you explain some of those arguments and offer some counterpoints to that?
Well, I won't attempt to explain the whole system of arguments, but let me start with the one that I think comes and concerns consumers and the general public perhaps the most. And they argue that without the CAFOs, then consumer prices for meat, milk, and eggs would just kind of go through the ceiling. That these CAFOs have kept meat, particularly meat and milk, affordable. And if we didn't have those, then they would go up. Or go up significantly. So what they don't understand and what people haven't looked at is there were significant reductions in the percentage of consumer income spent on food from the 1970s to the 1990s. Those were the early years when we were actually improving the efficiency of agriculture, and maybe we had CAFOs and chickens, but not a whole lot elsewhere. But since 2000, since the late 90s, since 2000, consumer food or meat, milk, and egg prices have gone up faster than the overall consumer price index. And prices, And food prices in general are higher than the price index. Now, milk is an exception to rising faster than the CPI because it hasn't been totally industrialized yet. So what's happened since we got into the 1990s, rather than continuing to expand production, which they did later on, rather than continue to expand production that would have brought down prices to consumers in this country, the increased production since then for chickens, pork, and beef has gone into the export market, not to keep prices low here, like Francis we're talking about. They're exporting it to other places and they keep the prices down here. What they've been able to do is they use that system that I've talked about before. The big corporations have gained control of that whole marketing system. So they start off then, you've got independent producers. First it was in chickens, but then it was in beef, and then it was in pork. But I was in Missouri at the time that they took over the pork industry. So I know the statistics on what was happening there. What happened is once they come in and got enough of the portion of the total hog production under contractual arrangements or under ownership to the large packing companies, then they begin to use their power in the marketplace to keep wholesale prices and retail prices low enough to move the product they had under contract, but didn't lower it low enough to move the independent hog producers through the market. And that's when we saw $9 hogs per hundredweight, which we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. And that's the way they squeezed out the independent producers that were even more efficient than they were. And since that period of time, they've used that market power to divert what would have gone to consumers in the form of lower prices to put product into the export market and to increase their margins for their shareholders. The benefits from any increased efficiency has not gone to the producers, who have to operate with more narrow margins as they continue to push down costs. It has not gone to the consumers. It has gone to the large processing companies that are in the middle and their shareholders, and they've continued to grow and control the overall market. So it's not about benefiting consumers, it's about benefiting these large corporations. You know, there's other things we could talk about. They say they're necessary to feed the world. They're not feeding the world, and they won't in the future. They say they're necessary for rural communities. They're not. They're absolutely destroying rural communities. You know, we can talk about those things, but I don't want to take too much time to go into the details. We get back to them, and there's many more of the fallacies, I call, of the economics of the markets. We don't really need them. They're not necessary. They're not essential.
Yeah, well, I'd like to follow that up with one of the viewer questions, actually, that sort of relates, and this is for anybody, but we'll start with you, John, and then maybe some of the others can weigh in. How can we affect meaningful change in our food system if it continues to be dominated by wealthy and powerful big ag lobbyists? Right. This is the question of the hour.
Yeah, let me start on that. I think we attack a lot of these problems in the process of changing the food system. I suggest that we start by attacking the problem of food security. Which means the hunger problem. You know, the overall industrialization of the food system hasn't solved the hunger problem. We have more people that are classified as food insecure in this country today, more than twice as many as we did back in the 1960s before this all started. We're not going to feed the hungry people by making food cheap. And the problem is that the market economy is impersonal. It has no respect for human being. It has no respect for need. It only respects scarcity and the ability to pay to make things scarce. So it doesn't affect that. The problem is the impersonal nature of it. The problem with government programs that are addressing food insecurity, and I don't want to detract from them because they're tremendously important for those people that receive the benefits, and they ought to be putting even more into it. But the fundamental problem is those two are impersonal. There's no sense of connectedness between the people that are paying for the programs, the taxpayers, and the consumers that actually receive the benefits. We need to see in our rural communities, we need to see in our communities across the country, the hungry people that are actually receiving the benefits that we're paying for through tax dollars. We need to feel a personal sense of responsibility. And that's the way we reform the food system. We start at the local level, where there's a personal sense of caring between the farmers and the people that eat the food, whether they're food insecure or otherwise. I think we've got to break away from just relying on the free market system, which is driven increasingly by big corporate interest. It doesn't even fit what we referred to as free markets in the past. It's all controlled by them. We've got to find a way to protect those root systems as they're nurtured and as they grow at the local level. I've suggested we establish community food utilities, where we use the same concept as we use for public water supply and sewer and public transportation, and that we take on within our communities the responsibility then within those community food utilities, which would involve the people that receive the benefits, the farmers and so on, to pay farmers that produce really good and healthy food, a cost of production plus a reasonable return on investment, just like we pay suppliers of the other public utilities. We ensure that everybody that wants to join this public utility within their community gets good, wholesome, healthy food, all of it they need, regardless of whatever government payments come in. The government payments could go into that system for the people that, you know, that want to join. It could be set up like what I call a vertical cooperative. The people that receive the benefits would be on the board, would be a part of it. The farmers would be a part of that. The processors, local processors, be a part of it. You know, I was even I was reading a book and he was talking about why we originally formed corporations. We can even form a corporation because within the corporation, you can decide who produces and who works and who receives the benefits internally. So there are ways that we can begin to reform this, but the key thing is, I think we have to start at the local level where people know each other, care about each other. The farmers want to produce good food. They want to get it to the people, and people want to know their farmers. They want to know the people. They want to know their neighbors, and they want to get reconnected again.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had that conversation earlier today about these small food systems and how we can, where everyone is connected and everyone knows each other, and how we can promote these. Ronnie, what do you think about how he's talking about at the local level, how we can get consumers, you know, purchasing these products straight from farmers? What do you think? You're obviously super connected through Organic Consumers Association with your platform to 2 million plus consumers. How do we reach more people with these messages about, you know, a new food system or a different food system, regenerative agriculture, and how do we change their minds?
Well, I think the heart of our degenerative system is the animal industry. Used to be called animal husbandry, you know. When my grandparents were organic farmers in Southeast Texas, where I grew up. And, you know, we have got to change this system. And so OCA is going to be launching a national campaign on July 4th with the Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal, elements of the climate movement like the Sunrise Movement, with LULAC, the civil rights organization, from the Latino communities who are very concerned about the working conditions of workers in the giant slaughterhouses. And the title of the campaign is going to be Boycott Big Meat and Build an Organic and Regenerative Food System. And we literally, I believe, have the opportunity in the wake of COVID-19 and the rise in concern since the George Floyd murder and the climate crisis to change people's buying habits. And the shameful thing in the United States is that 90% or more of our meat and animal products come from factory farms and gigantic, filthy slaughterhouses. And it's like, why are we buying big meat? You know, why are we buying it in the big box stores? You know, why are we buying food in fast food outlets that increases our chances of getting chronic disease or dying from COVID-19? Why do we let them feed our children and our elders in nursing homes, you know, this kind of low grade industrial food? And the meat that comes out of these factory farms and giant filthy slaughterhouses is not that healthy for you. But when you combine it with your normal fried potatoes, with terrible oils, you know, with your Coca-Cola, with your, you know, high sugar diets, it's a recipe for death, you know, and it's a recipe for, what's a recipe for dying? We're all going to die. But the point is to not have to die before your time and not to have a miserable quality of life, because the food system that Cargill and Monsanto and the rest of them have dictated makes you sick, you know. So we really have to get consumers to understand that, first of all, you don't need to eat 222 pounds of cheap meat every year.
Thank you.
You're endangering your health to eat, you know, 3 or 4 Whoppers every week with all the other crap that comes with it.
Yeah.
Second of all, the ranchers who raise animals typically are not the problem. They don't want to send their animals to some feedlot, you know, or to some hellacious slaughterhouse, you know, after they've bothered to try to raise them in many cases the right way, especially grass-fed beef and dairy.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got a system, like they've told me, Ronnie, we go to the auction barn and Cargill's there, you know, JBS is there, National Beef is there. They give us a price. They say, take it or leave it. We know our animals are going to hell after that. We know that the workers in these plants are working under hellish conditions. You know, we know that what comes out the other end of these filthy slaughterhouses and CAFOs makes us look bad as farmers and ranchers, but we need your help as consumers. So what we're going to declare on July 4th weekend, it's time to declare our independence from big meat and corporate agribusiness. It's time to put our money where our values lie. And obviously, we're not going to solve the problem of, you know, everyone in America needs to have access to high quality meat, animal products, fruits, vegetables, grains, everyone. The reason why organic is not 10 times larger than it is because when people pull out their wallets, the majority of people in America, they don't have enough money, they feel, to buy organic food or grass-fed beef or whatever, or, you know, organic fruits and vegetables. We have to put the money in people's pockets, period. Whether it's through a guaranteed wage or whether it's through like the Green New Deal that's been so well articulated by Bernie Sanders and even Elizabeth Warren, where they talk about that people have to be able to afford healthcare, food, housing. Everyone needs to have access to a job that pays a living wage, and not just a job, but a job that actually you can be proud of, a green job, you know, or a caring job. And we can do this. So it's going to take consumers have to stop buying big meat in big box stores. They got to stop going to fast food outlets and start, you know, doing what we've learned how to do as we've been quarantined the last few months. You know what? Home cooked food is much better for you. Home cooked food is even cheaper than fast food. Home cooked food can bring your family together. You know, as it gets safer and safer, let's get back to the way home cooked food was when I was growing up, where not only did the family eat together every night, but the extended family ate together. And we invited the neighbors over for the barbecues and the picnics and so on. And food was an important part of our culture. And farmers and ranchers were not the, and workers in the food chain were not the forgotten workers that they are today. I mean, in America, 40% of food chain workers, and there's 20 million of them, I believe, cannot afford organic food.
Yeah.
All right. That is an outrage. We got to change this. We got legislation out there. Booker's bill in the Senate. We've got
Farm
Rocon.
Reform Act, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. We've got bills that will level the playing field for small producers, ranchers, and farmers. We got to throw the bums out in November, and we have to throw the bums out at the local, county, state level at the same time. And we need to put in policies that are going to transform this food system. But we got to start, we have to stop buying the stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not talking about putting
It's interesting that you
unemployment for the you know, exploited workers. We're talking about every worker in these giant slaughterhouses needs to be able to leave that job, receive a wage, get retrained, and get another job. Every CAFO owner who wants to give up that miserable life needs to be able to get the money, like the Booker bill points out, to buy out their enslavement in the CAFO system and hopefully transform to something else. And again, I think we can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the ultimate form of rebellion is what? Growing our own food and cooking it ourselves, right? I guess.
Sherri, I'd just like to make a quick comment on the real bottleneck I see in making the alternatives much more affordable within the local areas or wherever is the processing plants that are out there today. The huge processing plants. They've effectively blocked the development of modest scale processing facilities. You know, Greg Gunther has his own where he kills like 50 hogs a week or something like that. It's very expensive to kill them at that scale. But in the middle scale, like they were when I was a livestock marketing specialist, we're relatively efficient. And the difference that people need to understand is that the margin of advantage for the big operations are tremendous for those corporations because of the volume that they move through the system. For example, if they've got a $15 a head advantage, let's say in one of the big operations relative to one of the more modest scale that could take individual farms like Greg Gunther's farms and run it through it, $15 a head on hogs, let's say, a 280-pound hog will cut out about 140 pounds of retail weight at the retail store. So if you take that difference then, that $15 a head, and you take 140 retail pounds, you're talking about what, just a little over 10 cents a pound. And with pork at $3 a pound, let's say in the retail grocery store today, you're really talking about what, less than 1%. Let's see, what would that, 10 cents a pound would be about 3%. Be about 3% of what your cost. But what we see today is much higher prices because they're taking it out. Now that $15 a head, you know, only means like 2 to 3% at the retail level when you and I are going to buy it. But for that processor that's killing 5 million head hogs a year, that's $75 million. Mm-hmm. And so they're not going to allow these other processing plants to be built, or they can compete them out of business. But we need to have regulations in place, and we need to have policies in place that will establish an opportunity to come in and build the modest scale processing plants, which would make organic, grass-based, free range much more affordable than it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you're bringing up Greg because he's so important. But earlier today, we were sharing some emails, and he mentioned, and this goes back to Ronnie's point about how we have to get away from big meat. A lot of these, you know, folks who are, he said something to the effect of, what if we could educate all of the people that SRAP works with in these communities when they're fighting CAFOs, but then they're going to the grocery store and they're buying the very meat, the industrially raised meat that they're fighting against? And how do we get them to change those habits and understand what they're supporting if they go to McDonald's or if they go to another fast food restaurant? So it's like so important to get people to understand that their buying power, you know, really can change things. And so I want to go back to Monica. I want to get to Francis, but and there's also a ton of questions here. I'm super grateful to all of our viewers for asking these questions. I want to get to some of those as well. But Monica, I know that you've lost, you know, that you're constantly in this community fight. And even if the fight is lost, you said something to me recently when we were just chatting on the phone, and you said something to the effect of things are never the same and people's attitudes change. So it's always important to get into the fight, even if you lose. Can you expound upon that a little bit and talk about how communities' attitudes might change through the fight?
Yeah, sure. One of the things I mentioned earlier was about educating people. What happens is you have to give people information. You have to let them know what is really going on. And even when you do your darndest to explain and educate, sometimes there are people that just won't get it, and sometimes there's people who don't want to get it. But each time we went before a Senate hearing, each time we went before a county council, each time we had a town hall, each time there was a letter to the editor, each time that anything we did as an organization happened, we know and we believe that seeds are being planted, you know, puns intended. Seeds are planted in people's minds, in their hearts, to start to slowly unravel the narrative of big ag. Their whole focus with their big money is controlling the narrative. It's that's it. So they want to make people think a certain way and believe that that's the truth. You know how, that what we're saying about the CAFOs is fake news, but it's not. It's not. And so when I was saying about the fight, it's important for us to have our voices heard, because one of the things I said to our group in our beginning days, when we got so much opposition, I mean, it was just, they were coming out of the woodworks. They lined up the farmers, they lined up the big ag companies. Everybody and their mother came out to run their mouth against the citizens and try to discourage us. And I said, sometimes those of us who are in the beginning stages, so we were the inception of this group in this area. Some of us in the beginning stages are going to get the brunt of it. We're going to get the most, it's like the front line, the soldiers on the front line, they might not make it, but we at the front line, some people lost their jobs. Some people had all kinds of harassment, all kinds of things, but you have to make a decision. If you want change, and if it's something that is very important and you believe in it, you will go forth and do what you can to make it happen. I'm inspired by, I can't even imagine, even what we're still dealing with in this country and its hatred and racism, what people endured during our civil rights movement and let alone slavery times, but in order to affect change, in order to say, we got to do something about this, and with all the opposition, but they still did it, and that's how it is now. We had people who were saying, well, my husband works in this industry and, all this kind of thing, but they slowly but surely, came along. And I have one friend whose husband, her whole family's in poultry, but she speaks out against it. So we have to say, it's not about people's feelings, just like while we're talking about this thing about George Floyd, people are like, hey, it's not about your feelings, about how you feel. It's about, what's happening to people. But we have to get beyond that and say, this is for the greater good. And what will I do to make a difference? What am I willing to do? And at the same time, we understand that with the soldiers in the fight, sometimes we have to let those soldiers move back and let the next group come up so that they can get the brunt of it, so we can tag team one another, so then that we can keep the fight going and keep it sustained. So it doesn't matter if we have some losses along the way. We know ultimately we're going to win. We know ultimately things are going to change. Every time you go in a store and now you see organic sections, you see produce and different things that you never saw before. You see more and more organic butcher shops and pasture-raised, meats that you don't have to drive, hours to get. Now I only have to drive 30 minutes to go to my butcher. And putting your money where your mouth is. When people say to me, and I'm not talking about people in food deserts, not people that are low income, that are in places where it is difficult to afford organic because of the way the pricing is, but people that can afford things and they say, oh, it's so expensive, but you'll go and spend $7 on a latte at a Starbucks, but you won't go and spend $15 for a chicken that you can feed your whole family. So it's about changing mindsets, and it's just keeping continually speaking the truth until it sticks.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Frances, I was going to go to you, but hold on one second, because I want to ask Matt, because he is speaking the truth through these films. So I want to ask you, you are, as much of a fighter in this fight, whether you plan to be or not, but when you're telling these stories, you become a part of that narrative that is, we so desperately need to get out there to the public. So how has the reaction to the Right to Harm film been since it's been out?
Well, the film is still seen as a niche topic at the moment, in terms of large distributors, ask why the film is not on a platform like Netflix or something like that. And it's because they see this as a niche topic, and And I think part of what we're doing tonight is helping to broaden the topic and broaden it to other people so that it isn't so niche. I just want to comment on something that, we were talking about earlier, and Monica made a great point about the industry always trying to control the narrative. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've noticed, and I think we can all speak on, is that the industry controls the land too. Access to land is incredibly difficult, especially for minority groups. And I'm from the Midwest. In the Midwest, we had Black rural neighborhoods that were pushed out by whites in those areas, and we don't have a lot of access. We don't have equal access to land, and part of building a local food system is breaking up these 1,000-acre farms and having much smaller farms that are managed by more people, and that would employ a lot more people, and it would bring a lot more diversity into rural America. And rural America is the leading poverty statistic in poverty group in the country. So this would be a way to increase the population size, increase the rates of poverty to pull rural America out of that. So I definitely think the land part of it needs to be part of the equation when we talk about how we reform our current agricultural system.
Perfect segue to Francis. So that's perfect. Thank you for setting that up. Francis, can you talk to us? I would love to know what your sort of take on the barriers holding farmers back from engaging in the type of agriculture that you promote, and then also policy. We have to talk about policy with you. So anything, what policy do we need to see change to support this future that you envision?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, Monica, you're very inspiring what you're doing, and that's great to see warriors like you out there. Great. I think sometimes it can be very discouraging that we see in Iowa, for example, the Farm Bureau and the ag commodity groups, the pork producers and the corn producers, they control the legislature. Any legislator who stands up and says no, they get kicked out because the money goes to their opponent. So it's difficult, but we're making progress. I remember back in the 80s in graduate school, I had been an organic farmer in the 70s, and I mentioned organic and they just about threw me out of the room. And so things have gotten better. We've made a lot of progress. So policy things, we can look for, John has a great vision for policy, but we can even look for little things that, just today, we heard that okay for dicamba, which has been causing huge problems as pesticide, herbicide, was the court said that they lost their license, and that's a tremendous victory. And other things we could do, just simple things like we get a lot of ag subsidies today, but they're not linked to environmental things. We need to link them to some regenerative farming practices, so that if you're getting a subsidy, as most farmers in the Midwest are getting a subsidy through crop insurance, that needs to be linked to certain practices to improve water quality, more regenerative practices, cover crops, and so on. So that's a very simple thing that we could do. We also, though, we need to look at, it's not been profitable. Farming's not been profitable for farmers. We need to look at ways that we can make farming profitable for farmers while we're making environmentally sound. And part of that's going to have to be to reduce our surplus production. We have overproduction for many, many decades. And so we need to find a way to put some sensitive lands off into environmental kinds of operations modes. And then we also need to find ways to not overproduce so much. And we need to link the two, environmental concerns along with subsidies that we're going to give to farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Ronnie, do you want to talk about the Green New Deal and how that might serve as a one-size-fits-all solution to some of these problems we're discussing?
Yes, I mean, in terms of what John brought up about the lack of infrastructure for small farmers and ranchers to be able to process their meat and animal products. I mean, can you imagine, we're facing the same thing down here in Mexico still as well. But can you imagine if anyone who wanted to set up a regenerative processing food chain could get a grant from the government to do that, or a no interest loan, long-term no interest loan? It's like we used to have 10,000 small processing plants for meat. Now we've got less than 1,000 of the smaller ones, and we've got 100 or so giants. It's just like, if there's the money there, since we have the market demand, we have to have policy that's going to provide the money, and significant money. I mean, what I loved about Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal plan, $16.5 billion, but over 10 years, $1.65 billion a year, was there was almost $1 billion over 10 years to transform $1 trillion to transform the food system. We got to get real. You know, we're not talking millions of dollars. We're not talking billions of dollars. We're talking trillions of dollars to fix the climate, to fix our food system, to fix our healthcare system, to bring us together. And we're going to have to take the power away from the elites that control it now and get rid of the worthless politicians who are indentured to the financial elite to do this. But if we have the resources, we already know what to do. We got the best practices, we got the market demand, we got the environmental and public health and climate crisis staring us right in the face. So, you know, the Green New Deal, when it was first articulated by the young climate activists and the Sunrise Movement and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I hope will be the president in 2024, by the way, when she's old enough to be the president. But when the Green New Deal first came out in late 2018, it was, the mass media was stunned because there was 80-something% support for it, including overwhelming majority of Republicans and independent voters. And so then the propaganda machine came out, oh, this is communism, this is going to bankrupt the country, this is going to take our hamburgers away, you know, this is going to take our you know, hot rods away in the garage. And but nonetheless, in the spring of 2019, support for the Green New Deal still was around 69% or so. And then so I was curious the other day, I was writing an article, I looked at the latest polls on the Green New Deal from February of this year, right before COVID-19 took over the public attention. Over 60% of Americans still support a Green New Deal. So, you know, our job is to get people to understand that a Green New Deal just doesn't apply to urban America, it applies to rural America as well. It doesn't relate to just alternative energy and energy conservation and transforming our manufacturing and transportation and housing. It relates to our food and farming system as well. We can solve the climate crisis. We can turn things around in 10 years, but only half of the solution is going to come from converting to alternative energy and energy conservation by 2030. The other half is going to come from changing our food and farming and land use system, and we can do it. But we have to, the title of my new book is called Grassroots Rising, and I'm trying to play on the fact that we've got to transform our row crop, industrial agriculture, factory farm system back into the grasslands and natural prairie that it once was, get herbivores eating grass again, get animals out of the animal prisons and back out onto the land, you know, value our farmers and ranchers, but it's also going to take a grassroots rising. I mean, I came of age in the 1960s in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the South. I grew up in a totally segregated city in Cancer Alley where the Ku Klux Klan, you know, and the police worked hand in hand to keep black people in their place, you know. But I saw an entire generation of people awaken and get organized, and we would have changed things. I mean, you know, they killed John Kennedy, they killed Robert Kennedy, they killed Martin Luther King. They repressed our movements as if we were terrorists. You know, they set us back, but we're back again. And this time we're multi-generational and multiracial, and the crisis is so much more intense, and it's global, and we're going to win. We're going to have a grassroots rising, and we're going to see a lot more grass in the Midwest and the plains, and a lot of animals outside grazing on that than you see right now.
So as we've been talking, I've tried to look over at some of the questions that are coming through from our viewers, and there are several questions sort of centered around plant-based eating and how that has a part to play in the climate solution. Does anyone, I'm a vegetarian, but I support, regenerative agriculture, animal agriculture, and I really try to fight for these small farms, these managed grazing systems, et cetera. So I always get asked this question a lot about, it's plant-based versus pasture-based or whatever. And would anyone like to speak to that conversation at all and about plant-based and where that fits and where regenerative agriculture also fits? Francis, do you want to take that?
Yeah, you can have very regenerative plant-based systems.
Yeah.
I know farmers who are doing it. So you can have because some people would argue you can't have plant-based systems that are regenerative. I argue you can do that. Now we need to keep in mind though that a lot of our lands in this country and all over the world are very fragile, and to cultivate them is going to set them back, and it has destroyed cultures, countries. So these fragile lands are best used for animal agriculture, for perennial crops, perennial grasses, perennial forages on the landscape. You don't till it up. And the thing is that with this animal agriculture, the impact of the animals managed right actually stimulates the whole system, and it improves the whole, it helps build up soil carbon. It's a regenerative system. It's really the definition of regenerative systems. If you look at in the prairies in the Midwest, in Iowa, they were built with the bison and the antelope running through their 50 million bison. And when the bison would come through, they would graze it off, and then the plant would slough some of that root mass into the ground, grow new tops and new roots. And so it was a cyclical thing that made these very productive soils here in Iowa and in the Midwest. And since we've been farming in Iowa, we've lost about half of our topsoil to erosion and about 60% of our organic carbon. We've lost about 60% of our carbon. But still, there's more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere and in the whole plant biosphere. So the soil is a tremendous pool for carbon. And if we start to put carbon back in there, we can take a lot of the carbon out. If we could increase our soil organic matter level by 1% around the world, we would take out enough carbon to bring it down to 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. So there's, as Ronnie's been saying, there's tremendous potential to sequester carbon. But I don't think it has to be an either or. It doesn't have to be either plant-based or animal-based. I think both can work.
Absolutely.
Let me comment very, very briefly on this. I think, as you said, Francis, that you can have a regenerative agricultural system without animals, but it's a lot easier if you have animals in that system to regenerate the waste and get it back into the soil and do the things that you've talked about here. You can have a healthy diet without animal protein within that diet, but it's a lot easier to have a healthy diet if you have the animal-based proteins within it. The studies that I've seen where they recommend, dramatic cuts or going to vegan diets and things like that, they're mainly looking at the alternative of taking CAFO systems, basically what we're talking about today, and somehow making those more efficient so that you can produce more with fewer breeding stock and cut down on the amount of inputs you have from grains and things of that nature. And there's very limited capacity to address issues like climate change by simply tinkering with the industrial system. I would argue that the scientists aren't looking at systems like Francis is talking about as alternatives to the industrial agricultural system. I think ultimately what we have to do is reverse this process of saying, what do we want to eat, or what do we want to consume, or what do we want to use, and how do we make nature give it to us? How do we torture nature till nature gives us what we want? We've got to look at how natural systems function, and many of those have animals. Practically every living, healthy ecosystem has something that performs the role of animals. We got to look at nature as a model and say, how do we fit our well-being as humans within the context of that healthy living system? And then we decide how many animals we need so that we can keep nature healthy, and then that will keep us healthy.
Absolutely.
I wanted to add one thing to that too. And that is, I've always talked about, I think that we need to eat the ecosystem, which is, I think, part of what we're all saying here. And Francis brought up, the bison, And if you look at the southern migration patterns of where the bison used to be, it sits right over the breadbasket America, which is where all the wheat is grown as an annual crop, but that used to all be perennial crops. And what sits underneath that is the Ogallala Aquifer, which has about 15 to 20 years of water left within that system. So this switchover from going to this highly perennial grass system in America prior to cultivation to going to annual crops, which is what's primarily grown throughout our country, has really depleted the land of resources. And the other thing too is that a lot of what we want to eat as consumers in terms of vegetables is highly dependent on calcium and phosphorus, and those nutrients primarily come from animals. So, you would never see in nature an entire field of tomatoes. You would never see an entire field of broccoli. These are the gems of the ecosystems that we've plucked over the years and have decided to cultivate into what we believe should be part of our diet. You would never see trees and trees of avocados growing in South America, which has depleted the water sources there, or you wouldn't see rows and rows of palm trees, to produce palm oil. So either way we go about, changing the food system, it has to be more about thinking about what the ecosystem will provide us with rather than what we want to eat.
So it's amazing listening to your talk, because you just said that you were a climate change denier at some point and you've changed your mind, it sounds like. And John, also you have this story of having changed your mind in your career. So would either of you like to talk, or any of you like to talk about, what is the thing that gets you to swap sides and say, I'm going another route here. Like what I knew before, what I believe wasn't accurate or wasn't working.
Well, let me start, and again, I'll be brief because I know we're running down on time here. But, I was thoroughly indoctrinated. I grew up on a small family farm that's very diverse, but I was thoroughly indoctrinated with 8 years of college and then basically 15 years as a livestock marketing specialist within the land-grant university system, where USDA and the colleges of agriculture and state departments of agriculture and everybody, was promoting industrial agriculture. And I truly believed, that it was going to solve the problems of hunger. We were going to make good food affordable to everybody because we're going to make agriculture more efficient. It's going to create profit opportunities for innovative farmers, and those profit opportunities would support viable rural communities. And I really bought into it because of that. But when I got into the 1980s, and I won't dwell on the difference, we had farmers going broke out here, and foreclosures and bankruptcy were regular fare on the evening news. And I was in Georgia at that time as head of the Extension Agricultural Economics Department, and farmers were committing suicide. We had to go out and work with them, try to figure out how they could save the farms, or at least talk them out of killing themselves. And I could see there was something fundamentally wrong with that system. And that's what brought about the transition to me. I'm convinced that people don't make big changes like I did, because it changed my whole career path. My whole future was changed. I was a department head. I wasn't going to go any higher administratively. All of a sudden, I'd been president of the Southern Ag Econ Association. I wasn't an economist anymore. They would say, well, a sociologist or maybe a socialist, but he's not really a free market economist anymore. So it's a big change, and I can realize what a big change it is for farmers out here that are trying to go through this, and they're locked into the system, and their whole culture's tied up in this industrial model of agriculture. What changed it for me is I never forgot why I got that education. And I didn't get it to drive farmers out of business. I didn't get it to destroy rural communities. I didn't get it to poison the environment with agricultural chemicals and biological waste. And I was still at a point where I said, there's something fundamentally wrong. I think to bring about big change, people have to come to the realization that what they believe in, what they're doing, is not working, and it's not going to work in the future. The second thing, they have to have a vision of what to change to. And I think that's what we're working on here on alternative systems of animal production, alternative agriculture, regenerative, sustainable, resilient, ecological, whatever we want to call it. We're working on this alternative vision for the future. And the third thing is they have to have hope. They have to believe it's possible to make that transition. I could see that it was possible for me to make that transition. Thankfully, I had academic freedom, so they couldn't fire me. but I had to fight my way through the last half of my academic career, but I was committed to what I was doing, and it's the best decision that I ever made.
I'm so glad you used the word hope, because my last question for each of you is what gives each of you hope in this system and in changing the system. So Monica, why don't you start?
What gives me hope is a belief, knowing just even over time, seeing how things can change through education, through connection, to hold on to that belief that things will not always be this way. And even seeing incremental changes in rural communities where you're seeing people who normally would have never spoken out for anything, who are doing so, who are stepping out of the norm. And there's a lot more independent thinking being developed these days and encouraged. And that gives me hope. So I know that as we continue in this fight, we have so many grassroots organizations and people across the country, around the world, who are fighting for change. And the more and more that we continue on, the more people that will get on board. And then this will become the new norm.
Absolutely. Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I'll go ahead and say that, sorry, Francis, sorry to cut you off there. I was going to say that, what gives me hope is just the changes I've seen in my local food system here in Chicago. And a great example is the artisan grain market. To get amazing stone milled flours from heritage grains or from heirloom grains was not possible about 4 years ago. And now it is everywhere in Chicago. We have seen the rebirth of a ton of new mills popping up, local mills that are providing where you can get flour that was milled the week before, or in many instances the day before, sent to you. And the fact that this grain market has started to shift over in the Midwest really gives me a lot of hope that the animal agriculture will also shift. We've certainly seen it in kind of a hyper sense in niche markets. And living in Chicago, having access to pasture-raised products and having access to amazing farm produce from farmers who I know, I know that there's only room for that all to expand. And just really quickly back to your question about what made me change, really, it was that I had this inherent trust in the food system. I trusted that those who were providing me with food had the best of intentions of providing me with healthy food. And when I recognized that that wasn't the case, it really took me for a major surprise. And it really opened my eyes to the fact that these industries do not have my best intentions in mind. They have their best intentions in mind. And once we have a food system that has the intentions of the health of the consumers and the mental health and physical health, then I think we'll have achieved true sustainability within our food system.
Absolutely. Francis, do you want to go next?
What gives me hope is people like Monica and John and Matt and Ronnie and yourself, because we've grown a whole movement nationwide now since back in the 70s when I felt like I was a loner out there, an organic farmer. And so we've made a lot of progress. It's all been very incremental. But now if you look around, we have model farms that show that regenerative farms show what can be done, show it can be done, and it's working. Mm-hmm. And so we have the status quo that's still here very strong and trying their best to hold on, but it's starting to crack. It's going to take a while, but I'm optimistic we'll get there.
Absolutely. Ronnie, you want to go next?
Yes, well, I've always been an optimist. I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, I actually believe there's this cosmic force out there that if you open your mind to it, it will inspire you and give you the strength to go forward. So I think that's, whether you call that spiritual belief or whatever, I think it's all important that we nurture our optimism and our spiritual, energy, because it's going to be a hard battle. But the other thing is, I've been fortunate to be able to travel all around the world and work with people. I mean, in Regeneration International, we have a core group of people in 30 different countries. And so we're all talking at the same time every couple of weeks. We have these 6 a.m. Zoom calls. And, you know, whether it's COVID-19 impact in Zimbabwe or the climate crisis in Chile, we're all talking about the same things, you know. And what we have in common, what I call the global grassroots, is that we're sick and tired of business as usual. We're tired of crooked politicians. We're tired of billionaires and multinational corporations trying to dominate us. We want a better life for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. And we have the ability to communicate and mobilize now on a global scale. And I believe we're going to do this. I think we're going to see a grassroots rising. We got a little touch of that the last week or so around the issues of police brutality and institutional racism. I think the people of the world are ready to go. It's our job to set an example in the United States, because we are the most powerful as well as the most destructive force on the planet. But also, I know everyone is looking to us in the United States. And if we will get on the right track, I mean, by God, look, we almost had Bernie Sanders as the next president. We came so close. If it weren't for the treachery of the mainstream corporate Democrats, we would have had a president of the United States that would have inspired the whole world, you know. But I can tell you this, I spend half the year working in Mexico and Central America. The whole world is looking at us right now, whether it's Minneapolis, whether it's Iowa. And I think if we rise to the occasion, we are going to be amazed that the people of the world are going to rise up too.
Absolutely. John?
Yes, people are asking me, you know, if I'm optimistic about the future. And my answer is I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
And to me, hope and optimism are different. Hope means that you know that something good is possible. And I know that something good is possible. I also say that one of the good things about being old is you can remember when things weren't like this. Because I saw this whole, in my lifetime, I have seen that whole industrial food system evolve. When I was growing up, we didn't have industrial agriculture. Our concept of industrial agriculture was the steam engine that they would turn out grade school, the country school where I was, so we could watch the steam engine go from one farm to another. That was the only mechanized thing in agriculture in our area. Everything else was with horses. We didn't have supermarkets. We had grocery stores where you took your grocery list in. The guy behind the counter would put stuff in a paper bag for you. We didn't have franchise restaurants and all of that. But what I saw happen during my lifetime, and it really happened in a period of about 40 or 50 years, was a total transformation in that whole system to the industrial food system that we have today. The industrial food system all the way through that we have today is pretty much like it was in the late 1990s. So that transformation happened very quickly once it started. It happened because of technologies, but a big thing was it happened because of fundamental change in farm and food policies in the 1970s that supported this kind of agriculture. The hopeful thing is that the alternative to the industrial food system, which all of you described here, is much further along today than was that industrial food system when I was a kid. We are well on the way to a fundamental transformation. I think it's going to take place regardless of what the government does in policy. But if we had a change in farm and food policy, and we're almost there, I'd never seen before the whole line of presidential candidates willing to base their campaigns on fundamental change. I'd never seen that in my lifetime since the 1970s, but it was there. But regardless, one way or the other, when this starts, it could happen very quickly. And that first transition happened one farmer, one consumer at a time, and it happened rapidly and the same transition can happen again. That's what gives me hope. The other thing is I firmly believe that we each have a purpose in life, not something to achieve, but something that we're meant to be doing with our lives. And I think if we each do that, no matter how small our part might seem, then we will have made the greatest contribution that we possibly could have made, and that together we will make that fundamental change to a fundamentally better society, better food system, better society, and a better future for humanity.
Thank you all. You are such an inspiration to me. So thank you so much for sharing your ideas tonight. I hope that our viewers enjoyed it. Matt, I want to go back to you really quickly. If somebody wants to screen this film and to show it, how do they do that? How do they get more information from you?
Just go to our website, righttoharm.film. You know, this was all put together through some amazing grants that allowed us to have some online screenings. So you can still do that if you're out there and you want to host an online screening. You know, that's still possible. The film is available on Vimeo as well, and we are hoping to get broadcast into a subscription platform at some point so we can really get out to the masses. So I want to thank all the other panelists for all your inspiration, you guys. You know, I've known you all for a number of years, and so thank you all for everything you do.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for the viewers for coming out tonight.
Thank you.